We've never met. The words didn't come out loud. Not at first. They lived in his eyes, in the way he looked straight through her, like she was part of the glass wall behind her, like she was just another reflection he didn't have time to notice. Then he said it, calm and clean, as if stating a fact. I don't believe we've met. The room didn't react right away. It never did in places like this, 47 floors above Manhattan, where silence was trained, curated, and expensive. A crystal glass chimed faintly somewhere behind him, a soft, accidental note that hung in the air longer than it should have. Naomi Carter stood still, one hand wrapped around the stem of a half-empty wine glass, the other holding a folded linen cloth that smelled faintly of bleach and citrus. Her posture didn't change. Not a flinch, not a shift. Just her eyes, steady, dark, fixed on his face like she was searching for something that used to be there. Rent. The kind of woman who belonged in rooms like this without ever questioning it. Daniel gave a small smile, the kind that never reached his eyes. They're trained well, he replied. Trained. The words settled into the air like dust. Naomi's hand paused for just a fraction of a second, the cloth pressed flat against the marble, the red stain already fading into a dull pink smear. For a moment, the reflection in the counter shifted, the overhead lights bending around the surface, catching the outline of her face beside his. Two figures, side by side, distorted by polish and distance. It lasted less than a second before she moved again, finishing the last stroke and folding the cloth neatly in her hand. She straightened, finally lifting her eyes, not to him, but just past him, as if aligning herself with the space rather than the man. It's clean, sir, she said softly. Her voice was steady. No tremor, no accusation, just a statement. Daniel nodded once, already turning slightly, already letting the moment dissolve into the rest of the evening. But something lingered, something small and stubborn, like a note played just slightly off-key. Because for a split second, before he looked away, he had seen it. Not the uniform, not the silence, but the memory of a girl sitting across from him in a crowded college library, sunlight caught in her hair, laughing at something he had said like it actually mattered. And he had buried it just as quickly, pressing it down beneath years of deals, expectations, and carefully constructed distance. Naomi picked up the empty tray beside her, the metal cool against her fingers, and turned toward the service hallway. The door at the end was half open, a strip of softer light spilling across the floor. As she walked, the sounds of the party faded behind her, the laughter, the clinking glass, the low hum of power and comfort. Her reflection followed her along the glass panels, repeating, fading, repeating again. She didn't look back. Not once. And behind her, Daniel Hayes stood perfectly still for a breath longer than necessary, his hand hovering near his cuff, as if he had forgotten what he was adjusting, the echo of a name he refused to say pressing quietly against the inside of his chest. The service hallway swallowed the light behind her the moment the door clicked shut, the warmth of the penthouse replaced by a cooler, flatter glow that hummed overhead in quiet strips of fluorescent white. And for the first time since she stepped into that room, Naomi allowed her shoulders to drop just an inch, not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for her breath to come back steady and slow, one inhale, one exhale, like she had practiced for years in places where being seen was not always safe. The tray still balanced in her hands as she moved past the stainless steel prep counters and the silent line of unused glassware, everything polished, everything in its place, everything temporary except the feeling that had followed her out like a shadow that refused to let go. And yet her steps did not falter, did not rush, because rushing meant breaking, and she had learned a long time ago how to keep moving without letting anything show on the surface, even when the past tried to press through like light under a closed door. And somewhere behind her, faint through the walls, the party continued as if nothing had shifted, as if no one had just erased an entire history with a single sentence spoken in a voice that did not tremble. And that was the part that stayed with her, not the words, but the calm, the precision, the way he had done it like he had rehearsed it, like it was not the first time he had chosen distance over truth. Naomi reached the sink, set the tray down, and turned on the faucet, the rush of water filling the space with a steady sound that gave her something to focus on, something real, something present, and she slid the cloth beneath the stream, watching as the faint pink stain dissolved completely, leaving nothing behind, No trace, no evidence, just clean white fabric again, and for a second, she stared at it longer than necessary, her fingers tightening slightly before she wrung it out and folded it with the same care she gave everything else. Precise corners, smooth edges. Controlled, always controlled, because control was the only thing no one could take from her now. And just as she placed it back on the counter, a voice came from behind her, older, softer. "You all right, Naomi?" She turned slightly to see Mr. Alvarez, the night supervisor, leaning against the doorway with a clipboard tucked under his arm, his eyes kind but observant in a way that missed very little. She gave him a small nod, the kind that ended conversations before they could begin. "Yes, sir. Just finishing up here." Her voice even, measured, untouched by anything that had just happened upstairs. He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded back, accepting the answer even if he did not fully believe it. "Take your time. They are going to be at it for another hour at least," he said, pushing himself off the doorframe and walking away, his footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving her alone again with the quiet and the soft echo of running water. Naomi turned it off and dried her hands, the paper towel rough against her skin, grounding, real, and then she moved toward the small locker area at the end of the hall, opening the metal door that held her few belongings, a folded sweater, a worn notebook, and her phone, which blinked softly with a missed call she had not heard over the noise upstairs. She stared at the screen for a moment, the name lighting up in familiar letters, then locked it again without returning the call, sliding it back into place, as if postponing that conversation would somehow keep everything balanced just a little longer. Outside the narrow window near the lockers, the city stretched wide and endless, headlights threading through the streets like veins of light, and for a brief second, her reflection overlapped with it, her face framed by the glass, distant but steady, and she exhaled slowly, pressing her palm lightly against the cool surface before letting it fall, because whatever he chose to forget, whatever version of the past he decided no longer existed, she still remembered, not just the laughter or the warmth or the sunlight that used to fall across worn wooden tables in quiet corners of campus buildings, but the promises spoken softly like they mattered, like they would last, and maybe that was why she did not chase him with questions, did not demand recognition, because some things, once denied, revealed more than any answer ever could. And when she finally closed the locker and turned back toward the hallway, her steps were just as steady as before, her expression just as calm, but something had settled deeper inside her, not anger, not even sadness, just a quiet understanding that whatever this place was to him now, whatever life he had built high above the city, she was no longer part of it, and maybe she had not been for a long time. The hallway felt longer on the way back, or maybe it was just quieter, the kind of quiet that stretched thin and made every step sound louder than it should, even when she tried to soften it, even when she kept her pace measured and even. Naomi moved past the service door again, but did not push it open right away, her hand resting lightly against the metal bar as voices drifted through from the other side. Laughter, low conversation, the soft clink of glass against glass, the same rhythm as before, unchanged, untouched, as if nothing had shifted in the space between two people who once knew each other in ways no one else in that room ever would. She could hear his voice too, steady, controlled, speaking about something financial, numbers and projections and timelines, the language he had mastered so well that it now sounded more natural on him than anything else. And for a moment, she stood there listening, not because she needed to, but because it grounded her, reminded her of the distance between then and now, between who they had been and who he had decided to become. And then she pushed the door open and stepped back into the light without hesitation, the room unfolding around her again in polished surfaces and quiet power. No one looking at her for more than a second, no one needing to, because she was exactly what they expected her to be, invisible in plain sight, moving through the space with purpose but without presence. She picked up another tray from the person in front of him, as if part of his attention had been left somewhere else and he had not fully retrieved it yet. Naomi looked away first, not out of fear, not out of avoidance, but out of choice, because looking longer would have meant giving something she no longer owed, and she walked forward, weaving through the guests with quiet efficiency, offering drinks, clearing empty glasses, her movements fluid and practiced. each action completing itself without drawing attention, until she reached the far end of the room where an older man sat alone, his posture slightly slouched, his hand resting on the arm of the chair, as if the weight of the evening had settled on him more than the others. His eyes followed her as she approached, not in the dismissive way most did, but with a kind of searching curiosity. "Water, please," he said softly, his voice carrying a hint of fatigue that did not belong in a room like this. Naomi nodded and set the tray down on a nearby table, pouring carefully, the sound of the water filling the glass steady and clear. She handed it to him with both hands, a small gesture, respectful, intentional, and he took it, his fingers brushing the rim as if he needed the contact with something real. "Thank you," he added, holding her gaze a second longer than expected, and something shifted in his expression, subtle but undeniable, like recognition hovering just beneath the surface. Naomi felt it too, a flicker of something familiar, something that reached back further than this room, further than this building, and before she could step away, he spoke again, quieter now, almost to himself. "Carter, is that your last name?" The question hung in the air, soft but precise, and Naomi paused, just for a moment, her breath steady, her posture unchanged. "Yes, sir," she answered simply, and the man's eyes widened just slightly, not in shock, but in realization, the kind that arrives slowly and settles deep, and across the room, unnoticed by most, Daniel's voice faltered for the briefest second before continuing, smooth as ever, but not quite as untouched as it had been before. The man did not look away after she answered, his fingers tightening slightly around the glass as if the name had weight, as if it carried something more than just identity, and Naomi could feel it in the space between them. That quiet shift when someone begins to remember something they were not expecting to find again. "Carter," he repeated under his breath, slower this time, testing the sound of it against memory, his eyes studying her face not with judgment, but with a kind of careful attention that made her stand still without meaning to, not frozen, just present. And then he leaned back slightly in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him as realization settled in. Not fully formed yet, but close enough to change the way he looked at her. "You used to be at Columbia, didn't you?" he said, not quite a question, more like a piece of a puzzle spoken out loud, and Naomi's grip on the tray shifted just enough to steady it, her expression unchanged but her breath pausing for the smallest fraction of a second before continuing again, smooth, controlled. "Yes, sir," she replied, the same tone, the same calm, but something deeper moved beneath it, something she did not let rise to the surface. The man nodded slowly, his gaze drifting for a moment as if pulling threads together. "Economics program," he added, almost to himself, and this time, Naomi did not answer right away, not because she could not, but because hearing it spoken back to her in this room, in this place, felt like someone had opened a door she had carefully kept closed, and before she could decide whether to respond, a voice cut in from behind them, smooth, composed, but carrying an edge so faint most would not notice it. "Is everything all right here?" Daniel stood a few steps away now, one hand resting casually in his pocket, the other holding a glass he had not taken a sip from, his attention directed toward the older man, but his presence shifting the air around them in a way that made the moment tighten. The older man glanced up at him, then back at Naomi, then back again, a quiet understanding forming that did not need to be spoken aloud. "Just getting some water," he said, his tone neutral, but his eyes lingered just a second longer than necessary, and Daniel gave a small nod, controlled, measured. "Good," he replied, before his gaze flicked, briefly, to Naomi, not long enough to be called recognition, but not entirely empty either, something restrained, something held back with intention, and then he looked away again, as if that fraction of a second had not happened, as if he had not allowed himself even that much. "We are about to start the presentation," he added, addressing the room more than either of them, and the subtle shift in energy followed immediately, conversations lowering, bodies turning, attention redirecting toward the center of the space where a large screen began to glow softly against the far wall. Naomi stepped back, her role clear again, her place returning to the edges where she could move without being noticed, but as she turned, the older man spoke once more, quieter now. You were one of the best students in that program. And this time, there was no uncertainty in his voice, only quiet certainty. Naomi paused, her back partially turned, her eyes lowering for a moment, as if acknowledging something she did not want to fully face here. Not now. That was a long time ago, she said gently, and then she moved, leaving the words behind her like something set down carefully, not discarded, just no longer carried in her hands. And across the room, as the lights dimmed slightly and the presentation began, Daniel stood facing forward, his posture unchanged, his expression composed, but his jaw tightened just enough to reveal the pressure beneath, because he had heard it, every word, every detail, and no matter how precisely he controlled everything else, memory was not something he could fully command, not when it was spoken aloud in a room where he had just claimed it did not exist. The lights dimmed just enough to shift the room into focus, the large screen at the front illuminating in a soft blue glow that reflected across polished surfaces and glass, turning faces into silhouettes and sharpening outlines. And Daniel stepped forward with the kind of confidence that had been built over years of standing exactly where he stood now, at the center of attention, in control, his voice steady as he began to speak about projections, partnerships, expansion timelines, every word precise, every pause intentional, the language of power flowing easily from him as if nothing had interrupted it minutes ago, as if no name had just been spoken that did not belong in this version of his life. And yet beneath the surface, something misaligned, something small, but persistent, like a thread pulled just slightly out of place. Naomi moved along the edge of the room, her steps quiet, her presence minimal, but her awareness sharp. She did not look directly at him again, not while he spoke, not while the room leaned in to listen, but she could hear the subtle changes in his rhythm, the half-second delays between sentences, the way his breath caught just faintly before certain words. Things no one else would notice unless they had once known him when he did not speak like this, when his voice had been less measured, more real, and she carried another tray now, refilling glasses, clearing space, her movements blending into the background as if she were part of the structure itself, invisible but necessary, until she reached the side of the room where the older man still sat, his attention no longer on the presentation, but on her, watching with a quiet intensity that suggested he was no longer simply remembering, he was understanding. "Why did you leave?" he asked softly as she approached, not demanding, not accusing, just asking the question that had been waiting behind recognition. Naomi paused, setting a glass down gently before answering, her eyes lowered slightly, not out of shame, but out of choice. "Life changed," she said, simple, controlled, offering nothing more than what was required. The man studied her for a moment longer, as if weighing whether to accept that answer or push further, but before he could speak again, a ripple moved through the room as Daniel concluded a point, light applause following, polite, expected, and in that moment of shifting attention, Daniel's gaze moved again, briefly, toward the side where Naomi stood, and this time, it lingered a fraction longer, just enough to catch the end of that exchange, just enough to see the way the older man looked at her, not as staff, not as background, but as someone who mattered in a way the room had not yet recognized. And something tightened in Daniel's chest, subtle but undeniable, because control depended on consistency, on narrative, on keeping every piece exactly where it belonged. And this was not where she belonged, not in front of him, not in this space where past and present were not supposed to touch. Naomi felt it too, that brief connection, that almost moment where acknowledgement hovered just beneath the surface, but she turned away before it could settle, before it could become something more than a flicker, and she stepped back into motion, continuing her work with the same quiet precision, the same steady rhythm, because whatever was shifting around her, whatever cracks were beginning to form in the carefully built distance between them, she was not the one who would break it open, not here, not like this. And as the presentation moved on and the room returned to its controlled flow, the city lights outside flickered against the glass, reflecting back 1,000 small points of brightness, scattered, distant, and impossible to fully hold together, much like the memory Daniel had tried to erase, now slowly, quietly, finding its way back into the room. The presentation ended on a note of controlled confidence. the final slide fading into a clean white screen before the lights gradually returned, restoring the room to its polished clarity, and the applause came again, slightly louder this time, not out of surprise, but out of obligation, the kind that followed success in spaces like this, where approval was measured and expected. Daniel stepped back from the center, offering a small nod, his expression composed, but the moment he turned away from the screen, the shift was there again, subtle but real, like the air had changed in a way only he could feel. Conversations resumed almost instantly, clusters of guests forming and reforming, voices overlapping in low tones about numbers, deals, opportunities, everything moving forward as if nothing had interrupted the flow, and yet his attention did not settle where it should. It drifted, pulled toward the edge of the room where she had been standing, where she was no longer, and for a brief second, something unfamiliar pressed against his usual control, not panic, not confusion, just a quiet loss of alignment, like stepping onto a surface that looked solid but shifted slightly underfoot. Naomi had already moved back toward the service hallway, her tray lighter now, her steps unchanged, steady, deliberate, the rhythm of her work grounding her in a way that the room behind her no longer could. She pushed through the door again, the softer light welcoming her back into a space where expectations were clearer, simpler, and she exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in release, the kind that came from stepping out of something that required too much restraint to hold together. She set the tray down and reached for another stack of glasses, aligning them with practiced precision, each movement controlled, each action measured. But her mind was not entirely in the present moment anymore, not after hearing her name spoken, not after seeing the way recognition had begun to surface in someone else's eyes, because that was the part she had not planned for, not the encounter, not the silence, but the possibility that the past could re-enter the room without her invitation. And before she could settle that thought, the door opened again behind her, slower this time, the sound softer but more deliberate, and she did not need to turn to know who it was. The shift in the air was enough, heavier, more focused. Naomi, his voice came, quieter than before, stripped of the projection he had used moments ago, closer to something real, something unguarded, and that alone was enough to make her pause, her hands stilling against the edge of the counter for a fraction of a second before she turned to face him, her expression composed, her posture straight, the same calm she had carried all night still intact, but her eyes sharper now, more aware, more present. Daniel stood a few feet away, no audience, no room to perform for, just the narrow space between them and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above, his jacket unbuttoned now, his tie slightly loosened. Small details that would have gone unnoticed earlier but now felt significant in their quiet honesty. He looked at her fully this time, not through her, not past her, but at her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching, not empty, but filled with everything that had not been said, everything that had been denied, everything that was now standing between them whether he wanted it there or not. And when he finally did speak, his voice was lower, more careful, as if each word had to pass through something before it could reach the surface. You did not have to answer him, he said, not quite a question, not quite a statement, just something in between, and Naomi held his gaze without flinching, without softening. He asked. She replied simply, her tone even, her words carrying no accusation, no edge, just truth, and that was what unsettled him the most, not confrontation, not anger, but the absence of both. Because it left him with nothing to push against, nothing to deflect, only the quiet weight of what he had chosen earlier. And for the first time that night, Daniel Hayes did not look like the man who controlled every room he entered. He looked like someone standing in front of a past he could no longer pretend was not there. The space between them held steady, not fragile, not tense in the usual way, but dense with everything neither of them had chosen to say yet. Naomi did not move, her hand resting lightly against the counter, her posture unchanged, while Daniel remained where he stood, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to avoid the appearance of something more. The faint hum of the overhead lights filling the silence in a way that made every second feel longer than it was. He let out a slow breath, not dramatic, just enough to shift something in his chest. his gaze lowering briefly before returning to her face. "I did not expect you to be here," he said finally, the words careful, controlled, but no longer distant. Naomi tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in acknowledgement. "Neither did I," she answered, her voice calm, even, as if they were discussing something ordinary, something that did not carry years behind it, and that steadiness forced him to hold his ground without retreating into the version of himself he had shown upstairs, because that version would not work here, not in this space where she was looking at him directly. Without the buffer of status or distance, he shifted his weight slightly, his hand brushing against the edge of the counter before settling at his side, a small, unconscious movement that betrayed more than his expression ever would. "You could have said something," he added, his tone quieter now, almost searching, and Naomi's eyes did not leave his. "You made it clear that I should not," she replied, not sharp, not bitter, just honest, and the simplicity of it landed harder than any accusation could have, because there was nothing to argue against, nothing to deflect, only the reflection of his own choice placed back in front of him without distortion. Daniel looked away for a moment then, his gaze shifting toward the closed door that separated them from the rest of the room, as if checking the distance he had created, measuring it, understanding it in a way he had not allowed himself to before. And when he looked back, something in his expression had changed, not fully, not completely, but enough to show that the control he relied on was no longer as absolute as it had been an hour ago. "Things are different now," he said, the words coming slower, less certain. And Naomi gave a small nod, her lips pressing together briefly before she spoke. "Yes, they are." And for a moment, that was all there was, the shared acknowledgement of a truth that did not need explanation, that did not need to be unpacked in this narrow hallway. And yet it lingered, pressing against the edges of what remained unsaid. Daniel took a step closer, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough to shift the dynamic, enough to make it clear that he was no longer standing behind the invisible line he had drawn earlier. "That does not mean I did not recognize you," he said, his voice lower now, more direct, and the words hung there, heavier than anything he had said so far, because they broke the illusion he had maintained in front of everyone else. Naomi's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened, not surprised, not even hurt, just clearer. "I know," she said quietly, and that answer, more than anything, unsettled him, because it meant she had seen through it from the beginning, that his denial had not protected anything, had not erased anything. It had only revealed something about him that he could not take back. He let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "Then why did you not call me out?" he asked, and this time there was something closer to vulnerability in the question, something less controlled. Naomi glanced down briefly at the folded cloth on the counter, her fingers brushing over its edge before she looked back up at him, her voice steady, grounded. "Because I did not need to," she said, and the answer settled between them with a quiet finality, not closing the conversation, but shifting it into something deeper, something neither of them could navigate with surface-level words. And in that moment, Daniel understood something he had avoided all night, that this was not about being exposed, not about being confronted. It was about being seen clearly without the power to reshape the narrative. And for the first time, standing there in a hallway far removed from the room, where he controlled everything, he had no version of himself to hide behind. The silence did not break right away. It shifted, deepened, like something settling into place that neither of them could ignore anymore. And for a moment, the hallway felt smaller, not physically, but in the way the space seemed to hold their history between its walls. Daniel's gaze stayed on her, not searching now, not questioning, just present in a way that felt unfamiliar even to him, while Naomi remained steady, her posture unchanged, her calm not forced but chosen, and that difference was what made it difficult for him to move forward with the same certainty he carried everywhere else. He let his hand rest against the counter, his fingers tapping once, lightly, before stilling again, a small gesture that betrayed the tension beneath his controlled exterior. "You always did that," he said quietly, almost more to himself than to her. Naomi's brow shifted slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of the tone. "Did what?" she asked, her voice even, and Daniel exhaled softly. his eyes lowering for a brief second as if the memory had come back without warning. "You never made things harder than they had to be," he said, and the words carried something warmer now, something closer to the past than anything he had allowed himself to show so far. Naomi did not respond right away, her gaze steady on him, but something in her expression softened just slightly, not enough to undo the distance, just enough to acknowledge that she understood what he meant. "And you used to make things simpler than they were," she replied, and that landed differently, not as criticism, but as truth shaped by time. Daniel gave a small, almost reflexive smile, the kind that appeared before he could stop it, brief and unguarded, and for a second, it did not belong to the man standing there now. It belonged to someone else, someone younger, someone who had not yet learned how to separate himself from everything that mattered. But the smile faded quickly, replaced again by the restraint he had built so carefully. "That was a long time ago," he said, echoing her earlier words without realizing it. And Naomi nodded once. "It was," she agreed. And again, the simplicity of it left no room for argument, only space for what came next. And that was where the shift began, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet movement beneath the surface. Daniel straightened slightly, his shoulders settling as if he had made a decision he could not fully explain yet. "Why did you not finish?" he asked, the question direct now, no longer circling around the past but stepping into it. Naomi's gaze flickered for the briefest moment, not away, but inward, as if measuring what to give and what to keep. Her hand moved to the edge of the counter again, fingertips resting lightly against the cool surface, grounding, steadying. "My mother got sick," she said finally, her voice soft but clear, and the words carried weight not because of how they were spoken, but because of how simply they were offered. Daniel's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to show that the answer had reached him, that it had connected something he had not known before, or had not allowed himself to ask about. "You did not tell me," he said, and this time, there was something closer to regret in his voice, something that did not belong to the controlled environment he was used to. Naomi held his gaze, her eyes steady. "You stopped answering my calls," she replied, and the sentence was quiet, almost gentle, but it landed with a clarity that cut through everything else, because it did not accuse, it did not demand. It simply placed the truth between them without decoration, and Daniel felt it, the full weight of it, not as a sudden impact, but as something that settled slowly, deeply, leaving no space to avoid it. He looked down for a moment, his hand pressing lightly against the counter as if anchoring himself, and when he looked back up, the distance he had tried to maintain all night felt thinner, more fragile, as if it could not hold under the weight of what was now being said. And for the first time, the man who had stood so firmly in control of everything around him was no longer entirely certain of where he stood in front of her. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and quiet, filling the narrow space between them in a way that made everything else feel distant, almost irrelevant. And Daniel did not respond right away, not because he did not have anything to say, but because for the first time that night, the answers he usually relied on did not come easily. They did not line up in clean, structured sentences the way business language always did. Instead, they moved slower, tangled with something he had not allowed himself to revisit in years. He let out a breath, deeper this time, his shoulders lowering slightly as if the effort of holding everything in place had finally started to wear through. "I did not know," he said, and even as the words left his mouth, he understood how incomplete they sounded, how they did not fully meet what she had just given him. Naomi did not interrupt, did not correct him. She simply watched, her expression steady, giving him the space to hear his own words for what they were. Not wrong, but not enough, and that was what made him shift again, his gaze dropping briefly before returning to her. "I should have known," he added, quieter now, the adjustment small but significant, because it acknowledged something beyond information, something closer to responsibility. Naomi's fingers moved slightly against the counter, tracing the edge without looking down, grounding herself in the present as the past unfolded between them. "You did not want to know," she said, her voice calm, not accusing, not sharp, just clear, and the difference mattered because it did not attack him. It revealed something he had to face on his own. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in defense, but in recognition, and for a moment, The only sound in the hallway was the faint hum of the lights and the distant murmur of voices from the other side of the door. He leaned back just a fraction, creating a little more space, not to distance himself, but to steady his footing in a conversation that no longer followed his rules. Everything was changing. Back then, he said slowly, as if choosing each word with care. My family, the expectations, the pressure to. He paused, searching for something that would not sound like an excuse. And that pause said more than the sentence itself. Naomi nodded once, not because she agreed, but because she understood the shape of what he was trying to say. So you chose the version of your life that did not include me. She finished for him, her tone still even, still controlled, and Daniel did not deny it. He could not after everything that had already been laid out between them. He let the silence sit again, this time not avoiding it, not rushing to fill it, just letting it exist, because for once, silence was not something to manage, it was something to hear. I thought it would be easier, he admitted, and there was no defense in his voice now, no attempt to justify, only a quiet honesty that felt unfamiliar but necessary. Naomi's eyes held his, steady, unwavering. Was it? She asked, and the question was simple, but it cut deeper than anything else, because it did not challenge his past decision, it asked him to measure its cost. Daniel looked away again, this time toward the floor, the polished surface reflecting a distorted version of both of them. And for a moment, he saw it clearly, the distance he had created, the life he had built, and the absence that had followed him into it whether he acknowledged it or not. No, he said finally, the word quiet but certain, and when he looked back at her, there was no attempt to hide behind anything else, no controlled version of himself stepping in to reshape the moment, just the truth as it was. Naomi did not react with satisfaction, did not soften in response. She simply nodded once, as if confirming something she had already known long before this conversation ever began, and then she reached for the cloth on the counter, folding it again with careful precision, the small, deliberate motion grounding the moment in something tangible, something present, because no matter what had just been said, no matter what had shifted between them, time had not reversed, and the life she was living now was not waiting for the past to be corrected. It was moving forward, steady and real. And as she set the cloth down, she lifted her eyes back to him, her voice quiet but firm. It does not change anything, she said, not as rejection, not as closure, but as truth. And that was the moment Daniel felt it fully, not as a sudden impact, but as a slow, undeniable realization that whatever chance he thought might still exist between what they were and what they had become, it was not his to define anymore. The words stayed between them, quiet but immovable, and Daniel felt them settle in a place he could not shift or negotiate, not with logic, not with time, not with the version of himself he had built to handle everything else. Naomi had already turned slightly, her attention returning to the small tasks in front of her, as if the conversation had reached its natural end, not abruptly, not coldly, just completely. And that was what made him hesitate, because he was not used to conversations ending without his direction, without his control shaping the outcome. He watched her for a moment, the way her hands moved with steady precision, folding, placing, aligning, small actions that carried a quiet certainty, as if her life did not depend on what he said next, and for the first time, that realization pressed against him in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting. Naomi, he said again, softer now, not to stop her, but because he needed the moment to continue. She paused, not turning fully this time, just enough to acknowledge that she heard him, her profile calm against the cool light. There is something you should know, he added, and the words came slower, not rehearsed, not structured, just honest in a way he had not allowed himself to be all evening. Naomi waited, silent, giving him the space to speak without interruption, without expectation, and he exhaled, his gaze lowering briefly before lifting again. The engagement, it is not what it looks like, he said, and even as he spoke, he knew how it sounded, how it could be taken, not as explanation, but as distance, as another attempt to reshape something that had already been made clear. Naomi's expression did not change, but there was a slight shift in her eyes, not interest, not curiosity, just awareness. It does not matter, she replied, her voice even. And the simplicity of her response removed any weight he might have hoped the statement carried, because it was not relevant to her, not anymore. Daniel's brow tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in the recognition that he was trying to offer something that no longer had value in this space. "It matters to me," he said, quieter now, and that was closer to the truth, closer to something he had not said out loud before. Naomi turned a little more then, facing him again fully, her gaze steady. "Then you should deal with it," she said, not harsh, not dismissive, just clear, placing the responsibility exactly where it belonged. And that clarity forced him to confront something he had avoided, that whatever choices he had made, whatever life he had constructed, it was his to carry, not hers to interpret or adjust around. The silence returned again. But this time it felt different, not heavy, not unresolved, but defined, as if a line had been drawn not with force, but with understanding. And from beyond the door, a voice called out faintly, someone asking for him, pulling him back toward the world he controlled, the one where expectations were clear and outcomes could be managed. He glanced toward the sound, then back at her, the hesitation visible now, no longer hidden behind composure. "I should go," he said, and for once, it was not an exit he orchestrated, it was one he accepted. Naomi gave a small nod, not as permission, not as dismissal, just acknowledgement. "Yes," she said quietly, and that was all. No added words, no attempt to extend the moment, because it did not need extending. It had already said what it needed to say. Daniel lingered for a second longer, as if searching for something else, something that could shift the direction. But nothing came, not in the way he needed it to. And so he turned, stepping back, toward the door, his hand resting on the handle for a brief moment before he pushed it open. The sound of the room rushing back in, louder now, brighter, pulling him back into the version of himself that existed out there. But as he stepped through, something had changed, not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but in the way he carried himself, in the way the silence from the hallway followed him into the light, and behind him, the door closed again, leaving Naomi where she stood. Still, steady, her reflection faint in the metal surface beside her, unchanged, grounded, as if the world had not shifted at all, even though something, quietly and irreversibly, had. The noise of the room wrapped around him the moment he stepped back in, voices overlapping, glasses clinking, the soft rhythm of controlled conversation returning as if nothing had shifted beneath the surface, and Daniel moved through it with the same composed posture, the same measured steps. But something in his awareness had changed. Every sound felt sharper, every glance more deliberate, as if the world he had built was still intact, but no longer as seamless as it had been an hour ago. Someone approached him immediately, speaking about numbers, about timing, about the next phase of the deal, and he responded, nodding, answering with the precision expected of him, his voice steady, his words aligned. But there was a delay now, almost imperceptible, a fraction of a second where his thoughts did not arrive as quickly as they used to, because part of him was still in that hallway, still standing in front of a truth he could not adjust or reframe. And across the room, near the edge where the light softened, Naomi re-entered quietly, her tray balanced, her movement smooth, as if nothing had interrupted her rhythm. She did not look toward him, did not need to. Her focus remained on the work in front of her, refilling, clearing, moving through the space with the same quiet precision that had defined her all night. And that distance, that choice not to engage, not to pull him back into the moment they had just left behind, made everything clearer in a way he had not expected, because she was not waiting for him, not watching him, not shaping her actions around his presence. She was simply continuing, and that continuity held more weight than anything she could have said. "Daniel." A voice called from his side, pulling him back fully into the present. It was the older man again, now standing, his posture straighter, his expression thoughtful. "You did not mention that one of your staff studied economics at Columbia," he said, his tone neutral but carrying a quiet implication. Daniel's gaze shifted to him, then briefly across the room before returning, his response measured. "It did not come up," he said, and the answer was technically true, but it felt incomplete even as he said it. The older man studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if understanding more than what had been spoken. "Some things are worth mentioning," he replied, and then he turned, stepping away without pressing further, leaving Daniel standing there, with the weight of that observation settling in alongside everything else. And for a moment, the room seemed to slow, not visibly, but in the way his perception shifted, the conversations around him continuing, the movement constant, but his focus narrowing, pulling inward, toward the realization that the version of himself he had maintained was beginning to fracture in ways that could not be repaired with simple adjustments. He glanced toward the far side again, finding her without trying, the way she moved through the space unchanged, unaffected by the shift he was experiencing, and that contrast sharpened something in him, not regret alone, but recognition, the understanding that she had carried something forward while he had chosen to leave it behind, and now that distance was no longer theoretical, it was visible, undeniable, present in every step she took that did not include him. A server passed by him with a tray, the faint scent of citrus and glass cleaner trailing in the air, grounding the moment in something ordinary, something real, and Daniel reached for a glass without thinking, holding it without drinking, his fingers tightening slightly around the stem as if anchoring himself. And for the first time in a long time, the room he stood in did not feel entirely his, not because he had lost control of it, but because he had gained awareness of something beyond it, something that could not be managed or contained. And as the night continued, as conversations rose and fell and the city lights flickered beyond the glass, Daniel Hayes remained exactly where he was expected to be, but the certainty that had once defined him no longer sat as firmly beneath his feet. And across the room, Naomi Carter continued her work with the same quiet strength, not needing the room to change, not needing him to become something different, because she already knew who she was, and that, more than anything else, was what he could not ignore anymore. By the time the evening began to thin, the energy in the room had shifted from sharp focus to something softer, looser, conversations drifting into quieter tones as deals were no longer being pitched, but remembered, and Daniel stood near the glass wall. The city stretched endlessly beneath him, but he was not looking at it the way he usually did, not as something he had conquered or contained, but as something distant, almost separate from where he stood, his reflection faint in the glass beside the lights outside, overlapping in a way that blurred the line between presence and absence, and behind him, the room continued to move, but he did not turn right away, not when he heard the subtle change in sound that came from staff beginning to clear the space, trays moving, glasses collected, the quiet rhythm of ending replacing the earlier intensity, and when he finally did turn, his gaze found her again without effort, Naomi moving along the far side, gathering what remained, her movements just as steady as they had been at the beginning of the night, untouched by everything that had unfolded between them, and that was what drew him forward, not urgency, not impulse, but something quieter, something more deliberate. He crossed the room slowly, not weaving through people this time, but waiting for space to open naturally, as if he was no longer trying to control the pace of anything. And when he reached her, he did not speak immediately. He simply stood there for a second, close enough for her to notice, far enough to give her the choice to respond, and she did, turning slightly, her expression calm, her eyes meeting his without hesitation, without expectation. "It is almost over," she said softly, glancing briefly at the room before looking back at him, and he nodded, the small movement carrying more weight than it should have. "Yes," he replied, his voice quieter than it had been all evening, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the space between them no longer tense, but not empty either, just clear, defined by everything that had already been said. And then Daniel did something he had not done all night, something that did not fit into the structure he had maintained. He reached for one of the empty glasses on her tray and placed it down on the table beside them, not because it needed to be moved, but because the gesture grounded him, brought him into the same physical rhythm she had been in all along, small, practical, real. Naomi noticed it, not the action itself, but the intention behind it, and her gaze shifted slightly, not softer, but more open. "You do not have to do that," she said, and there was no resistance in her voice, just a quiet acknowledgement. Daniel let out a small breath, almost a reflection of a smile, but without the ease that usually came with it. "I know," he answered, and that was the point, because this time, He was not acting out of expectation, not following a role. He was choosing something without needing it to change anything, and that difference settled between them in a way that felt new, unfamiliar but honest. "I handled things wrong," he said after a moment, the words direct, without decoration, and Naomi held his gaze, steady, listening but not reacting immediately, giving the words space to exist on their own. "Not just tonight," he added, quieter now, and that was where the truth deepened, where it extended beyond the present moment into everything that had come before. Naomi's fingers adjusted slightly on the tray, her posture still composed, still grounded. "I know," she said, echoing her earlier answer, but this time it carried something different, not just awareness, but acceptance, not forgiveness, not dismissal, just recognition of what was already clear, and Daniel nodded slowly, the motion deliberate, as if he was accepting something he could not undo, something he could only face, and for the first time, there was no attempt to fix it, no effort to reshape the outcome, just the quiet acknowledgement of what was. And as the last few guests began to leave, the room opening up around them, the lights settling into a softer glow, Naomi stepped back slightly, shifting the tray in her hands, preparing to move on, and Daniel did not stop her, did not ask her to stay, because he understood now that this moment was not his to extend, not his to control, and as she turned to continue her work, he remained where he was, watching for just a second longer before letting his gaze fall, not in defeat, not in loss, but in something quieter, something closer to understanding. Because for the first time, he was not trying to change how she saw him. He was beginning to see himself the way she already had. The last of the guests filtered out slowly, their voices fading into the elevator lobby, the soft chime of doors opening and closing marking the end of an evening that had once felt so controlled, so certain, and now left behind only the quiet aftermath of polished surfaces and dimmed lights. The city outside still alive, still moving, but distant through the glass, like something separate from the space inside. Naomi moved through the room one final time, collecting what remained, her tray lighter now, her steps unhurried, each motion deliberate, not because there was much left to do, but because she finished things the way she always had, completely, without cutting corners, without rushing past what still needed attention. And Daniel stood near the window again, not in the center this time, not where he had been earlier when everything revolved around him, but slightly off to the side, as if the shift in his position reflected something deeper, something he had not yet fully named, but could no longer ignore. He watched her as she moved, not openly, not in a way that demanded her attention, just quietly, taking in the way she carried herself, the steadiness, the absence of hesitation, the clarity in every small action, and for the first time, it was not the past that held his focus. It was the present, the reality of who she had become without him, without the version of their life he had once imagined and then abandoned. Naomi reached the final table, setting down her tray and gathering the last few glasses, the faint scent of citrus cleaner rising again as she wiped the surface clean, removing the final traces of the evening as if erasing something that had already run its course. And when she straightened, she did not look around to see if anyone was watching. She did not pause to reflect. She simply turned toward the service hallway, ready to step back into the space that had always belonged to her more than this room ever had. And it was in that moment that Daniel moved, not quickly, not impulsively, but with a quiet intention that carried him across the distance between them one last time. "Naomi," he said, his voice low, steady, and she stopped, turning just enough to face him, her expression calm, unchanged, as if she had expected this final moment, but did not depend on it. He held her gaze, not searching now, not asking for something undefined, but speaking from a place that no longer needed to be hidden. "I am sorry," he said, the words simple, unadorned, and for once, they did not sound like something practiced. They did not carry the weight of expectation or the need to be accepted. They were just true. Naomi looked at him for a moment, her eyes steady, taking in the shift, the absence of defense, the presence of something real, and she gave a small nod, not as forgiveness, not as closure, but as acknowledgement. "Take care of yourself, Daniel," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet warmth that did not reopen the past, but did not deny it either, and then she turned stepping toward the hallway. The door opening with a soft push before closing behind her with a muted click, leaving him standing alone in the space that had once felt like everything, and now felt different, not empty, not lacking, but changed in a way that could not be undone. Daniel remained there for a moment, his reflection faint in the glass beside the city lights, his posture no longer defined by control, but by something quieter, something more honest. And as he looked out over the endless grid of streets below, he understood something he had not allowed himself to see before. That power had never been about what he could hold on to, but about what he had chosen to let go, and who he had become because of it. And somewhere beyond the walls of that building, beyond the reach of the life he had built, Naomi walked forward into her own path, steady, certain, carrying nothing from that night except the quiet confirmation of something she had always known, that she did not need recognition to have value, and she did not need the past to return in order to move forward. And in the stillness that followed, with the lights dimmed and the room finally silent,